My name is Adam Payne. I'm a farmer in Devon and a member of the coordinating group of the Land Workers Alliance. I'm very happy to be chairing this session here today on workers' power. It's a shame not to be gathered together in person, but one of the benefits of this is to be able to bring together some incredible speakers from around the world and focus our attentions on the experiences and strategies that have been developed. And in the next hour, we'll hear from three amazing speakers from movements in 3 continents who are all working to protect the rights and improve the conditions of agricultural workers. The exploitation of people and planet throughout the supply chain is a core characteristic of the industrial food system and takes place largely with impunity on the part of corporations involved. The food system created on the basis of this exploitation has terrible consequences for workers' rights, the environment, consumer health, and our objectives of building a safe, fair, sustainable, and just food system based on agroecology and food sovereignty. In the coming years, land grabs, conflict, food security concerns, and climate change will force more workers into precarious situations, and experience shows us that it will be down to social movements and unions to hold corporations and governments to account and to implement fair and just systems. Our hope for the session, for which we have an hour, is to share experiences of effective and powerful approaches in order to inspire us all to think bigger and work harder on the basis of these examples. To further this, we have 3 incredible speakers from unions and movements in Brazil, the United States of America, and Europe, who are pioneering strategies to improve workers' conditions and limit the power of transnational corporations. We have 3 speakers, and we're going to start with Tishena, a community lawyer from the movement of people affected by dams in Brazil, an amazing social movement advocating for the rights of people displaced by dams and infrastructure projects, highlighting the devastating impacts of these and supporting displaced people. She'll speak on the binding treaty on transnational corporations and the scope, potential, and state of play of legal instruments in this struggle, as well as sharing thoughts on how to achieve these in contexts such as Brazil, the United States, and the UK, where governments are openly opposed to rights-based approaches and hostile to accountability. We'll then hear from Gerardo of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, a worker-led human rights organization at the forefront of fighting the trafficking, slavery, sexual violence, and economic oppression suffered by many of Florida's farm workers. He'll tell us a bit about their organizing relating to the Fair Food Program, an amazingly inspiring campaign focused on mobilizing public pressure to secure agreement with food retail giants to only buy from growers who accept standards set by the workers. This strategy has effectively harnessed retailers' power to enforce a human rights program that is designed, monitored, and enforced by the workers whose rights it protects. We'll talk a bit about how the strategy developed, how successful it is, and share examples of what it's achieved, as well as sharing some thoughts on developing a similar model in Europe. Finally, we'll hear from Federico from SOCSAT, a workers' union in Spain and a member of the coordinating group of La Via Campesina in Europe. Federico will focus on the state of play in Europe, drawing out the interconnections between the struggles and sharing ideas on how European civil society and farmers' movements can work together more effectively to target corporations using both international legal mechanisms and more organized direct action. This should leave us with some time for discussion and questions after the interventions. We'll take some questions from the chat, so please put them in as you're listening. But bear in mind that time will be limited and we'll only be able to select a few. I also want to say that Shena and Federico will speak in Spanish, which you should hear interpretation. Myself and Gerardo will speak in English. I hope the audio all works. And as such, I want to remind everyone, speakers and myself particularly, to speak slowly to assist the translation, to make sure that everyone can understand the details of what's being said. So with that, thank you all very much for coming to listen. Thank you, speakers, for being here, and over to Tishena with 12 minutes, please.
Hola a todos y todas. Muchas gracias.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much for having me here, sharing our experiences. I come from the movement of the people affected by dams, and I'm also linked to La Via Campesina, which is connected to clock in Latin America. I would like to share with you our struggle against multinationals and their impact. Lately, from La Vía Campesina, we have been investing so much work into putting up a binding treaty for multinationals. It is paramount to contextualize why do we want these treaties to be binding, and why is it that related to the rural world and peasants? Multinationals are worldwide known. They have been grown and they've been accumulating cultural, social, financial power, even bigger than the power accumulated by states. So the power of some multinationals is higher than that of many states. So we wanted to highlight the fight and the struggle of unions and workers. The last 15 years, we've been facing the architecture of impunity. These companies are just breaching every right. They are polluting. We are talking about the relationship of these companies with the criminalizing of social movements and crime against those movements. These companies are interconnected and they are not responsible, they are not liable, they do not respond for those crimes they commit. So this is a problem that is framed since the 70s in the frame of the international law. But we had to wait up to 2014 for a resolution to be issued in which a working group was created to begin from 2015 onwards and work specifically on this topic. In the United Nations, there were similar experiences with the Observatory of Multinationals. The value chains, the global value chains, have been accumulating. As peasants, we really do know well the way in which everything is distributed in the agribusiness and all the big pharma, big companies like Monsanto, Syngenta. All this information fades away magically when the World Trade Organization steps in. From the 80s onwards, from the 90s onwards, there were so many bilateral treaties, TLCs. The European Union had an important role, as well as the United States, in order to develop and design these treaties. And these treaties were against people's sovereignty and people's rights and food sovereignty. The debate is intertwined with the furthering of capitalism and neo-colonialism, the North and the South, big French corporations going to other places and they exploit their workers. We could also say that these inequalities are replicated in Europe within the European Union. These hierarchies happen too between Germany and workers of the Eastern Europe. We need to observe these dynamics and how it's becoming increasingly difficult for peoples to face corporations. And I'm talking on behalf of Latin America. In Paraguay, for example, we suffered the Monsanto's presence. There was a coup in Brazil, and oil companies were involved in it. Back in the 70s, there were coups in Guatemala, and it was also connected to multinationals. So wherever we see regular coup d'etat, then we see behind the shadow of these corporations. Why do these companies go to other countries? Because the human rights are not as solid there, and they just profit from this vulnerability. There are some directives, some principles. They are voluntary directives for companies in order to push forward human rights. Companies are acknowledged as agents, as stakeholders of the international scene. So everyone takes part, everyone is an agent. So big companies have the very same presence in the international areas as we do as peasants. And so they are involved in every multilateral arena, and they capture the IoT. They are trying to capture the human rights councils in the United Nations that receives money from Microsoft. All these companies are occupying these spaces. And in these companies, it's impossible to have a dialogue or a debate because they do not represent an elected mandate. They have really opaque investment schemes. They have tax havens. Everything is kind of, there's a lot of secrecy around that. So it's very difficult to fight transnationals. What do we say in Brazil? We cannot talk with the management. We cannot work on lobbying with the investors. They are never there. They are always absent. So these principles we were talking acknowledge the social corporate responsibility, but that is just a whitewashing, because a company can destroy a whole river bank and then just pay a fine, and the state receives some funds as a compensation, but the problem is not solved. It is paramount to tackle this issue within the European Union, within the UK, because it is specifically the European Union who was blocking many of the human rights issues. And this happened due to the interference of the World Trade Organization. Companies should be liable, and we want more efficient mechanisms for them to be liable. But every time we try to do so, and the last 2-3 years, the process was stagnant like this because of the European Union obstaculizing. The government of Ecuador was trying to apply some measures to improve the situation in relationship with the multinationals, but the position of Europe fostered a revision of the principles, and this poses a great danger. We need to be alert. We can, of course, be very critical with most of the proposals, and we were very critical of the amendments and the articles included in this proposal. But I'd like to wrap up my speech talking about what can we do. One, we need to put pressure on the governments and visibilize what they are doing with the multinationals. We can do that at a national level, but also at a regional level. We can trigger a campaign in Europe and the US where the companies have their headquarters. It's important to lobby PMs. We belong to the global south and we take it on the chin. We receive all the impact of these dynamics. So a mining company from the UK violates the rules in Brazil. We should be capable of taking that to court in the UK. We really do need an international coordination of all PMs to actually put a break to this process. We need to regulate capital. We cannot talk about human rights as leading our life, but it's just a profit. And that's why the environment is being destroyed and people are being destroyed because everything is capital centered. This is increasingly so. And maybe later on we can debate these issues. Thank you very much. My time's over.
Thank you very much, Chena. That was fantastic. Thank you. Really fascinating contribution and lots to discuss there in terms of how we go about building the architecture of this kind of international solidarity and implementing these strategies. I'd like next to welcome Gerardo from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers to speak a bit about their work on the ground in Florida with the Fair Food Program. Gerardo, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about who we are. I'm part of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is an organization based here in the southwest part of Florida in the United States. And the CIW, or our letters, was founded in 1993, fighting against abuses that range from wage theft, stagnant wages, being paid 40 to 45 cents per a 32-pound bucket of tomatoes, which means that a worker had to pick 2.5 tons of tomatoes just to make the equivalent of minimum wage. So our fight has been to increase wages, but also to eliminate other abuses like situations of violence in the fields, sexual harassment and sexual assault impacting close to 90% of farm worker women, according to a study that was published several years ago by the Southern Poverty Law Center. 90% of workers, female workers in the fields, are suffering sexual harassment and or assault. And on top of that, as if this was not enough, situations of modern day slavery. Workers have been forced to work at gunpoint under threats of death in several of the cases that we have helped by working with the FBI and the Department of Justice to bring these cases to a resolution. More than 1,200 workers have been freed from these conditions. And the solution to this issue, we don't see it in simply pursuing what's available according to the law. We see the solution becoming a reality if we're able to prevent these cases from continuing. So with that in mind, the coalition did several actions in the 90s to try to bring the growers to sit at the table. Now we're talking about an industry that produces about 90% of the fresh tomatoes that are produced in US soil east of the Mississippi during the months from November to May. So we're in the height of the season right now. We're talking about around 33,000, according to numbers from the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange, in which the gains of what I'm going to share with you in a second are being applied through the Fair Food Program. But before we got to that, in order to eliminate all of these issues, all of these abuses, the coalition of Immokalee workers started to think outside the tomato industry or the agricultural industry to start focusing on the market also. The buyers of tomatoes, like Taco Bell, McDonald's, Burger King, and many others, have used their incredibly huge buying power to drive prices down. So we as workers saw an opportunity because we knew that these corporations were getting profit from the suffering that they were leaving behind. And we said, if these corporations, by not moving a finger whenever any of these abusive, extreme abusive behaviors hit the news, then we need to bring that connection to the public. And we brought our theory of change that said that we as workers were poor because at the top, the profit that should be getting to the workers' pockets in the form of livable wages were going instead to rich executives that were pressuring the agricultural industry to lower the price of the tomatoes and everything they need. That's the modus operandi. So we decided to go after the buyers and ask them to join us in this effort to eliminate modern-day slavery, to eliminate sexual assault, and to eliminate child labor, along with all the other list of abusive behavior that has always plagued the industry. That's why in the year 2000, we started to prepare for the last action focus on the growers. And we started to think about how are we gonna push the different brands to join onto what we call the Fair Food Program. In 2001, we declared a boycott of Taco Bell after several attempts at trying to connect with them. It took them 4 years, but for us, it took a lot of work with different groups in different parts of the country, but especially with students, with religious leaders, and more inspiring than anything, with other workers along the tours that we did in those years of boycott. It was 4 years that basically harnessed the power of over 300 universities and some high schools. The National Council of Churches had joined in support of the coalition of Immokalee workers, asking Taco Bell to join and to buy only from farms that were willing to implement the code of conduct that we as workers were going to craft. So after 4 years of boycott and after a lot of protests across the nation in support of the boycott of Taco Bell, in support of the workers, Taco Bell and its parent company, John Brand, came to the table. That was in 2005. Since then, until 2011, which is when we started to implement the Fair Food Program, there has been 14 agreements until today, 14 agreements with corporations, including some of the ones that I mentioned, Taco Bell, Burger King, Subway, Whole Foods, even Walmart is on board on these agreements. There are legally binding agreements that commit the buyers to implement a program that was crafted by workers that will be implemented with legally binding agreements with the tomato producers of the tomato industry of Florida. When Walmart came on board in 2014, we expanded the protections that I'm going to mention now to 6 different states. And now we are implementing this not just in 7 states in tomatoes, but also in other crops. We just expanded to Tennessee, the production of flowers. What does this mean when workers are part of the Fair Food Program? Well, this means that they will receive a booklet like this. This booklet contains the list of rights that I've been talking about that are part of the Fair Food Code of Conduct. Inside this booklet, workers will read in 3 different languages, Spanish, Creole, and English, because those are the 3 main spoken languages in the fields. There's many indigenous languages. There's many other workers that speak in other languages, but in Spanish, more or less, people are able to communicate. And we as an organization also work on providing for people when they want to make a complaint, which is one of the rights that is included here, the right to complain without retaliation. In the past, you spoke, you're fired. If you are lucky, that's the only consequence. But if you spoke, you would very likely become a victim of violence and or be fired and or have to deal with retaliations constantly for speaking up. And the solution was not something easy to be able to get. Today, workers don't have to give up their dignity. In the past, you would have to just keep your mouth shut, because if I ask anyone in the audience, you know, if somebody was to give you wages that were stagnant for more than 30 years, you know, and I'm talking prior to the Fair Food program being implemented in 2011, if anybody asks you if you would be ready to lose your job, meaning losing your ability to feed your kids because you're living day by day, workers would have to deal with this question, especially women working in the fields and confronting situations of sexual harassment. And the answer, when you ask anyone, like, what would you do if you were in the shoes of a worker who has to pay rent at the end of the week, who has been receiving these wages that are not allowing these workers to be able to feed their families in a dignified way? Would you be willing to risk your job, meaning losing the food for your kids on your table? And the answer for that is no. Nobody would do that, because if you are poor, you are vulnerable. You need to change the conditions that makes it necessary for people who have to put their head down in front of abusive behavior. So we've been fighting for this for more than a quarter of a century now as an organization. I've been involved in this for the past 20 years. And I can tell you that when workers are part of the creation of their own solutions, but backed by the powers that are taking, in this case, the form of rights in the fields, if we use the market or we use what we have around that can help us to be able to transform the conditions that our communities are facing, then I think we have a chance to be able to expand all of this. The Fair Food program also includes a bonus that gets paid by the corporations. It started, people identified as a penny per pound. It's a little bit more than a penny per pound. And since 2011, with about 20% of the market buying tomatoes from these states and some other crops and paying a premium, there's been more than $35 million that have been distributed through the payroll systems of these companies to workers in farms that are participating under the program. That doesn't mean much if you think about 2011 until today, if you think about the amount of workers that are being impacted, but that means something very fundamental. It's a change that it's transforming the way in which we are perceived also as not just hands to do the job, but human beings that deserve to be protected, especially now in times of COVID. But another one of the things that we have been able to do, and I'm not gonna go into all the rights that are included on the booklet, but I'm gonna tell you this. We as workers here in the US, at least in agriculture, have never been valued. You know, we hear now conversations about being essential, but we have not been receiving the provisions and the respect that we need to receive from government, from anyone who benefits from the hard work that we are doing to provide food for the entire nation. So what I'm gonna say is, it is time to work together to expand protections like this so that we can achieve what the Fair Food program has achieved, which is not just the identification of cases of abuse, but the elimination. There hasn't been a single case of modern day slavery happening in a participating farm. And now there are the mechanisms that are zero tolerance for crimes like that. Also, the same is true now for sexual assault and for child labor. And there's nothing in the world that can say that this is possible, to be able to bring issues that have existed for generations and bring them to an end by working together with consumers, by working together with students, with other workers in other parts of the country, with churches. We have been able to create what we call the worker-driven social responsibility model. And we aim to expand this. I'm going to close by saying we are working with Justicia Migrante, Migrant Justice in Vermont, to apply something like this in the dairy industry. They did it successfully, and they have created the first report. So I encourage you to learn more about migrant justice and their Milk with Dignity program. This program is also being implemented in the textile industry in Bangladesh, and it's also being implemented here in construction in Minneapolis. So replication is ongoing, and we are going to invite anyone who wants to learn more about this to get in touch with us, because we're willing to share this formula as long as anyone is ready to be able to implement it in a form that empowers workers and that uses and leverages the forces that are against us to be able to transform the lives of more people. So thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you, Gerardo. That's an extremely inspiring and positive story of what can be achieved with the right organizing. And we'll come back to this in questions, no doubt. But before we do, I'm going to pass over to Federico from SOCSAT in Spain to hear a bit about the state of play in Europe, and sharing some ideas on how we can implement some of these strategies, both international legal strategies and the kind of grassroots direct action organizing we've just been hearing about within Europe. Federico, over to you.
Hola, gracias, Adam.
Hello, thank you, Adam. Thanks to the organizers. I think an important thing is something I need to talk about now. We need to give motivation. We need to talk about the strategy we have for coordination, for struggle amongst peasant organizations and members of civil society. We need to fight the impunity of multinationals and the modern slavery that people have been talking about. So an initial idea is, well, I think Jenna made this very clear. The power of transnational is very clear in all of our economic life and socially, politically. We can't implement peasants' rights or other things we need if we don't have a specific strategy against this power and the impunity of transnationals. We need resistance. We need to be strong. So Jenna mentioned we need to fight for the binding treaty, state standards, and we need to apply the general human rights rules. We also need to work with direct action, trade union action, grassroots organizations, and also with control and certification organizations Gerardo mentioned. There's another key point we have to remember. So we fight against multinationals. At the same time, we have to build up alternatives to these multinationals with agroecological production, food sovereignty, and different models of production, marketing, and consumption. The second idea, the role of the EU and Europe in general, the European Economic Area, the UK. So the role that Europe plays in defending multinationals and the role it plays in the agri-food market. It's the biggest exporter of agri-food products in the world. So Chenna mentioned this. The EU has played a vital role in blocking the binding treaty in terms of controlling multinationals and watering it down. The EU has a double role internally. So it prioritizes circulation of capital and the European market above social rights here in Europe. And at the same time, it supports the work of multinationals at an international level. So if we talk about mobilization and activism in Europe, we always need to think about these two issues. We need to work for our rights here in the continent of Europe. At the same time, we should be working for the rights of workers and peasants organizations around the world and the rest of the world, where European power and European companies are present. At the same time, if we look at the role of transnationals in violation of the rights of peasants and rural workers, there are various scenarios. On one hand, in the south, you've got land grabbing or resource grabbing. This really damages farming and destroys peasant economies. This is not just happening in the south. Big companies are grabbing land through investment funds here in Europe as well, changing land use, and affecting greatly food production. So you can see in France, for example, that you've got big influence of big companies on land tenure and agricultural production. It's another point to look at. So as peasants and migrant workers, so you have transnationals present at borders. So you've got internment camps. You've got people benefiting from repressive policies and from closing down of borders. Finally, we should look at the exploitation of rural labor. There are different sides to the production chain and supply chain. So we see this in agro-industrial production at large facilities. As I mentioned, this is in the hands of large companies. Also, we need to look at transport and marketing, which is controlled by a few big multinationals. Also, product conditioning, and also organizing employment. So you've got a monopoly by a few companies putting workers in a more vulnerable situation through indirect contracting systems. So people are getting into a more precarious situation. So alliances are vital in our work. I would like to focus a bit, say I'm from the Andalusian trade union of rural workers. So we've got cooperatives for agricultural production. So we work with day laborers and migrants. We've used a certain strategy and it's been very useful. So commercial pressure. So when you have labor disputes in agricultural companies, we've allied with consumers and other actors in the countries where these products are going to. We apply pressure through big supermarkets and certifiers. We apply pressure on those companies for them to resolve conflicts and respect labor rights. Biosol, for example, working with Migros in Switzerland and Reyes in Germany. There are also other companies where we've used pressure with Tesco in Britain, using the Scopolis campaign, amongst others. In our trade union, we've constantly been working on communication with consumers in countries that import these products. This has been a constant feature in case of disputes. So the people certifying and marketing products, these companies, all have a shared interest. We mustn't pull the wool over our own eyes. They're the capitalists. They are counterattacking. They try to delegitimize and reduce the effect of commercial pressure strategies. So a few things I'd like to comment on in relation to our experiences at SOAC and Via Campesina. So it's important to have direct action in the territory where the conflict is being generated or where rights are being violated. Right there, the workers themselves, those activists have to take action. It's good to have a stable organization that can be monitoring what's going on. Gerardo mentioned also, you can have certification systems, labels that work in a participative way. Then we can constantly see if rights are being respected or not at any given time in companies. We need to work with the whole supply chain, from production to sale, and work with those contradictions in interests, the conflicts of interest, at different stages, at different links in the chain. So we need to include supermarkets and distributors, but also certification bodies, particularly in the organic sector. They have a key role to play. Consumer pressure can be more effective in that way. So alliances. We need those between trade unions and also consumers' organizations. Also, between workers from different sectors in the chain and in different countries as well. We need that alliance between the organic sector and climate, human rights, the right to food, between salaried workers and small rural producers. So in all of this, we need to ensure that the producing company or the marketing company loses money. They need to lose money. Their profits fall. So this can be through strikes where production takes place or through boycotts that can damage the brand of the marketing company. So you could have short-term boycotts or relating to certain products or direct action in the countries where these products are exported to in the north. And the press can play an important role as well. So people become made aware. So the public knows through specific campaigns and through a concerted follow-up as well. We have various instruments for this. So in the Via Campesina in Europe, ECVC, and with other allies, we've set up a platform for exchanges to share struggles. We share information between different grassroots organizations, and we also organize these mechanisms to apply commercial pressure between producing countries and consumers. So I need to really deepen this. So, for example, the Lenny network is important in Europe. Now, round off now. So I think this event can be useful so we can move forward in Britain and across Europe. So there are networks for struggle and resistance at a grassroots level. We need them. We need to be able to cause economic damage to these big companies, but we shouldn't forget something else. There's another side to this, as Jenna mentioned. We need international binding standards favoring human rights and not just for whitewashing. If not, it's a real step backwards. In order to do this, European organizations have to work in different territories in Spain, France, Britain. There are platforms that we're working on for this. We need to pressure our countries so they set up national progressive legislation so there is more continuity with the binding treaty. This is important work to do. So there are peasants and consumer groups and various different groups. We need to build up alternatives to this agribusiness model, this agro-industrial model that's coming from multinationals. This is being deepened. There was a green revolution. We fought that. We're using agroecology as a different option. Now they're talking about smart agriculture. Lots of technology is used, and really all they're doing is continuing to take power away from the grassroots, from peasants and from workers. We need to resist this by creating strong, sustainable, and radical alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. Now we have a bit of time for questions. We've got a lot coming through on the chat here, so I'm going to ask some of those. Could I ask all the speakers to unmute themselves and turn on their video so we can have some dialogue here on these questions? So the first one we've got that I'm going to ask everyone, but try and be brief with your answers because we have 15 minutes for the questions here, is can you share some thoughts on how workers' actions can help ensure the enforcement of a binding treaty on transnational corporations? And I'll go first to Shana, if that's okay. And we'll go through these in the same order as the speakers earlier on.
Well, I think the question was asked as well about cooperative models. Now that's very important as well. They create alternative mechanisms for production and marketing. That's very important. It's great to have alternatives to the big global value chains. Now, in terms of trade union organizations, it depends on the country to a great extent. We know that when corporations have been strong, there have been strong attacks on trade union organizations. Also, there's representation on the ILO of big groups. I think there are different positions. So corporate social responsibility is a highlighted approach. We need pressure through trade unions in this discussion on global value chains and on multinationals. We need to build up resistance within the ILO as well. It's corporate capture going on, so we need to fight that. I think it's a historic challenge at the moment for progressives. How can we reactivate and coordinate trade unions to fight capitalism?
Thanks, Gerardo. Do you want to come on that?
Yeah, what I want to say is that, you know, in the context of farm workers in the US, we're talking about workers who have been historically disenfranchised and always exploited in terms of agriculture. In the world, the same is true, even in our own country, you know. If you are a farm worker, you are viewed as somebody of less value. When you think about the value that you have and what you can negotiate with, I think that we need to also embrace our ability as negotiators. In our case, we can negotiate with, you know, things, with capital, with possessions. The only thing that we have, it's our humanity, and we need to protect it. And the thing that we need to use to negotiate is our collective power. So we have been using it to bring this fight to the corporate world and bring this corporate world to be part of the solution. But I think that it's important to make a distinction. You know, in our case, it works because there are legally binding agreements that are the elements that makes it work, that include workers not as the topic of conversation, but include workers at the driving seat of these efforts. they are the monitoring agents that are reporting the problems, the abuses, so that the solution can happen. And they do it from the fields. Why? Because they are not afraid anymore in participating in farms. That this reality is not true for most workers in the US. So we want to expand this. What I want people to realize is that if we push together corporations to join onto the program, every time that a corporation joins, we are able to expand these protections to other places because we have already built them and they have already been implemented in 8 states in different sectors across the United States and across the globe. So I think that we just need to be able to understand that for it to work, it needs to include workers at the driving seat. And we need to do anything that we can as communities, as workers, as supporters, to be able to harness that power and put the workers as part of the I don't know how to say it, la punta de lanza, the one
spearhead.
directing the efforts. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Federico, what are your thoughts on this?
Sí, yo quería un poco destacar,
I'd just like to return to the idea that to progress and resist, we need to create alternatives. So these systems proposed by transnationals in agribusiness and savage capitalism, I think this is incompatible with the proposals about food sovereignty, agroecology, and labor rights. We need to do this trade union work while we are building up alternatives. Cooperatives are an interesting issue. While we're creating alternatives and resistance models, capital, in turn, will create new mechanisms to counterbalance that. Looking at cooperatives, I'll give you an example. In Andalusia, we have cooperatives that have come from taking control of land, like Marina Leda and other places. So they're good examples, positive examples. But we have difficulty when it comes to protecting these against market attacks and attacks by big companies, but also local governments. Always favors the market and the power of companies. We also know, in Italy, for example, this the cooperative model is being used to set up false cooperatives. Workers supposedly are owners of this company, but in reality, what's happening? It's just self-exploitation managed by the company. They're selling their labor. Really, it's a trick. So China says something important. We need to work as a network. One network alone in one sector, in one territory, can't achieve a great and deep change. We need to work as a network in all sectors, in all countries. And we need to keep an eye on each other. Multinationals are powerful, and we are comparatively weak in those terms. Trade unions are an example. We can see the weakening of large unions that are becoming less combative as well. We need to support each other to create an alternative system and to have strength against the great power of multinationals.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We've got another whole load of questions here about the about how we can roll out the worker-driven approaches like the Fair Food Programme. So I was interested to also put that to the panelists and hear your thoughts on implementing an approach like this in international supply chains like those in Europe and in situations where workers are not already well organized. So again, let's go through in the same order as the panel presented and hear your thoughts on what are the opportunities and the challenges for rolling out that kind of approach in Europe. So Shana, will you go first?
Okay. I'm not in Europe, And I don't know that context in much depth. I think that there's a lot of trade union struggle in many countries. There was a great mining organization. I've heard about one in France, for example. It's a big challenge to enter a deep debate, looking at the supply chain, the global value chain. It's destroying trade union organization. So lots of workers go to lots of companies go to other countries with cheaper workers. There's fragmentation. It increases alienation from work. So it's harder and harder to have awareness about our own products and our own work and what we're doing. Often, the mining companies take land. We could stop the company's trains. That's like, say, a week's supplies. So it doesn't cause a big economic impact. We'll just be criminalized. There are some laws that are being passed in many countries, particularly in the global south. I've seen some in demos in France, where links are made with terrorism. We need to really watch out for hegemonic discourse. Often popular struggles are being outlawed. The fascist governments are trying to do this. And there are strong ones in Europe. So that's a big problem. So I won't say too much because I don't know this issue in depth.
Okay, thank you, Gerardo.
In regards to the implementation of something like the Fair Food Program, I mean, this is something that is already being implemented. As I mentioned earlier, the opportunity is not just an opportunity to create something, it's the opportunity to roll out something that other workers in other realities are already doing. So I mentioned, for example, Meal with Dignity program, which is a program they created after they shadowed the work of the coalition in terms of organizing, in terms of pushing corporations to join onto the program, but also in terms of the phase of implementation of the program, which starts with the education, the monitoring that follows after every single education session. We train workers, we visit them at least twice a year, and we're talking about around 30,000 workers, as I was mentioning. So it's a really, really demanding job, but with the support of the community. And that's why it is very important, not just to include them, but the rights that are included in this program were created by workers. If the same is true and the same elements are gathered, you know, the forces that create that poverty for those communities that are fighting to improve wages or eliminating, in the case of workers in Lesotho, for example, textile industry, they came to us and they learn about the program, and then they roll out something that they are trying to implement to eliminate sexual assault, which was happening for a workforce mainly made of women, 80% women, 20% men. Among those 20%, the supervisors that were basically exchanging proposals to people looking for work. Women searching for a job would find the disgusting proposal of a supervisor that they had to go out with them if they wanted to keep a job. All of these stories are part of what is being implemented to actually change the conditions. So what I think is needed, we need to also be able to see that not everything that is talked about today, it's working or it's real even. And I want to mention, not to get into much detail on that because it's a long topic, but there is a study that's called MSA Integrity. That's the name of the organization. And they did a research of 10 years from Harvard, where they mentioned 40 different initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives and different approaches, both from the private sector, corporate sector, and different efforts that are happening that are not actually delivering on the promise of change. So what I also want to ask people to do, not just ask us about how to roll this out, but ask you to visit this. I'm going to place the link for it to be shared about this report. It's important for us to be informed of what works so that we can support it. And it's important for us to also make the distinction of what doesn't work, because corporations, as Federico was mentioning, they're co-opting everything. So we need to be able to be a few steps ahead of them and bring them to do what's necessary through legally binding agreements so they cannot leave, as Kenna was mentioning. That's something very common. But pushing them to sign legally binding agreements in the places in which they are implementing programs created by workers, I think it's an opportunity that we cannot let pass. And so I would say that in regards to that question.
Brilliant, thanks, Gerardo. And finally, Federico, what are your thoughts on this?
Sí, a ver, en el tema, lo que decía Adam, del qué pasa cuando no hay trabajadores organizados.
Regarding what Adam was saying, what happens when workers are not organized? This is the reality, this is the rule. In agriculture, in most countries, there is no grassroots for workers' organizations because of the migrants, because there's ongoing change, a lot of pressure. So the big unions are just missing in action when it comes to to rural workers and field workers. So it's paramount that peasant movements and agricultural movements are organized all over the world and all over Europe, especially because action and organization is a must in the grassroots. We cannot only just campaign on the top. And that's the role of La Vía Campesina and rural movements. We need to work in network with consumers, with every stakeholder, with every actor, but the grassroots is paramount.
Thank you, Fede. On this note, we have to wrap up the session as our time is finished. We had more than 4,500 people online listening to interventions, and there's nothing I'd like to do more than for all of us to go down to the pub now and carry on talking about this and taking these conversations further. But for now, that interaction has to happen online and through other forums. So I just want to close by thanking everyone for their participation, for coming to listen to this session, for sharing your work and for the work you're doing in your day-to-day. It's been really inspiring, and hearing these interventions has affirmed, I hope, the power of international solidarity and the power that can be achieved by, as Gerardo says, putting workers at the point of the spear. So on behalf of the Land Workers Alliance, thank you for your interest and for coming along to this session. We'll carry on working on this issue with La Vía Campesina and with other organizations around the world. And I encourage everyone to check out the links that have been shared and check out the organizations, movements of people affected by dams, La Vía Campesina, and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And on that note, we have to close this session. So thank you all. It's been fantastic to listen to you. Thank you also to the interpreters for their hard work in making sure that we can have this kind of exchange across languages.
Thank you so much.